The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of Millbrook. As Sarah Chen adjusted her rifle scope, watching the empty intersection below from her perch on the third floor of the old library. 3 weeks had passed since the outbreak began, and the once bustling suburban town had become a graveyard of overturned cars and broken dreams. She had not been a park ranger before. All this started, comfortable with solitude and skilled with firearms, but nothing could have prepared her for what the world had become. A distant moan echoed through the empty streets, followed by the distinctive shuffling sound that had become the soundtrack of their new reality. Sarah's grip tightened on her weapon as she scanned the area below, her trained eyes searching for movement among the debris. The dead had been quiet for the past 2 days, which made everyone in their small group of survivors nervous. Quiet usually meant they were gathering somewhere, and gathering meant trouble. Down in the library's main hall, Marcus Rivera was carefully rationing their dwindling food supplies, his engineers' mind calculating consumption rates and estimated survival times. The former construction foreman had natural leadership qualities that had kept their group of 12 survivors alive this long, but even he was starting to feel the weight of responsibility. They had maybe 4 days of food left, and their water supply was running dangerously low. The old man, Professor Williams, sat nearby organizing their medical supplies with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades teaching chemistry before the world fell apart. Movement on the south side, Sarah's voice crackled through their makeshift radio system as she spotted 3 figures stumbling between the abandoned cars. The zombies moved with that characteristic unsteady gait, their decaying bodies responding to some primal hunger that death couldn't extinguish. These weren't fresh converts, their clothes were torn and stained, their skin had taken on that sickly gray pallor that marked the truly gone. One was missing an arm, another dragged a broken leg, but they kept moving with relentless determination. The group had learned to classify the undead by their condition and behavior. Fresh zombies were fast and dangerous, retaining much of their human strength and coordination. These older ones were slower but no less deadly, and their numbers were what made them truly terrifying. For every zombie they put down, 2 more seemed to take its place, as if the infection was spreading faster than they could contain it. Young Emma Torres pressed herself against the window of the children's section, her teenage eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination as she watched the creatures below. She had been visiting the library for a school project when the outbreak hit, and Sarah had found her hiding in the storage room 2 days later. The girl had shown remarkable resilience, adapting to their harsh new reality with the flexibility that only youth could provide. She had become their scout, small enough to move through areas the adults couldn't access, and brave enough to volunteer for dangerous missions. The zombies below had stopped moving, their heads turning in unison towards something beyond Sarah's line of sight. This coordinated behavior was new and deeply unsettling. In the early days of the outbreak, the undead had seemed driven purely by individual hunger, stumbling toward any living thing they encountered. But recently, the survivors had noticed signs of pack behavior, almost as if the creatures were learning to hunt together. "They're looking at something," Sarah whispered into her radio, her voice tense with concentration. "Something we can't see from here." Marcus set down his inventory sheet and moved to the radio, his weathered hands steady despite the growing tension. "Can you get a better angle?" Before Sarah could respond, a new sound cut through the morning air, the rumble of an engine. Everyone in the library froze, hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. Other survivors met potential allies, additional resources, and desperately needed human contact. But it could also mean raiders, people who had chosen to prey on the weak rather than work together for survival. The engine sound grew closer, and Sarah could see a modified pickup truck moving slowly down the main street, its windows reinforced with metal mesh and its bed equipped with makeshift armor plating. The vehicle moved with purpose, its driver clearly familiar with navigating through zombie-infested territory. More importantly, the zombies were reacting to it, their attention shifting from whatever had caught their interest to this new source of noise and movement. "Survivors," Sarah reported, her voice carrying a note of cautious optimism. "Armed vehicle, moving toward the town square." They look like they know what they're doing. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone, was whether these newcomers would be salvation or just another threat in a world where the line between friend and enemy had become dangerously blurred. The pickup truck rolled to a stop in front of the library, its engine ticking as it cooled in the morning silence. Sarah kept her rifle trained on the vehicle through the scope, her finger hovering near the trigger as she watched for any sign of hostile intent. The driver's door opened slowly, and a tall man in military fatigues stepped out, his hands visible and empty. He wore the weathered look of someone who had been fighting this war since the beginning, his dark hair streaked with premature gray and his eyes carrying the weight of too many losses. "Sergeant Jake Morrison, United States Army," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the empty street. "I'm looking for survivors. If anyone can hear me, we're here to help." He gestured to his truck, where Sarah could now see two other figures moving carefully behind the reinforced windows. The man's posture was confident but not threatening, suggesting military training tempered by weeks of navigating the delicate politics of survivor encounters. Marcus emerged from the library's main entrance, his own rifle held at the ready but pointed toward the ground. Years of construction work had taught him to read people quickly, and something about the soldier's demeanor suggested genuine intent rather than predatory behavior. "We're listening," he called back, positioning himself where he could dive for cover if needed. "But we've learned to be careful about trust." The sergeant nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "Smart policy. We've encountered groups that shoot first and ask questions later." He slowly reached into his pocket and produced a laminated map, holding it up for Marcus to see. "We're part of a reconnaissance unit tasked with locating survivor communities and establishing evacuation routes to secure zones. According to our intel, there's a government facility about 60 miles north that's still operational." Sarah's radio crackled as she reported the conversation to the rest of the group. Professor Williams moved to the window, his academic mind analyzing the newcomers with the same methodical approach he had once applied to chemical equations. The old man had survived this long by being cautious, and something about the military presence both reassured and worried him. Government involvement could mean salvation, but it could also mean that the situation was far worse than they had imagined. Emma pressed against the glass, her young eyes taking in every detail of the newcomers' equipment and behavior. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger, a survival instinct honed by weeks of constant threat. The soldiers felt different from the raiders they had encountered before, their movements were disciplined, their weapons well maintained, and their leaders seemed genuinely concerned about civilian welfare. The conversation between Marcus and Sergeant Morrison was interrupted by a low moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The three zombies that Sarah had spotted earlier had been joined by others, and now a group of nearly a dozen undead creatures was shambling toward the sound of human voices. The newcomer's truck had drawn them like a dinner bell, and they were converging on the library with the relentless determination that made them so terrifying. "Contact left," Morrison shouted to his team, dropping into a combat crouch as he brought his rifle up. The soldiers' movements were fluid and practiced, suggesting countless hours of training and real-world experience. His team responded instantly, two figures emerging from the truck with the coordinated precision of a well-oiled machine. One was a woman with short blonde hair and the lean build of a sniper, while the other was a younger man whose nervous energy suggested he was relatively new to this kind of combat. Sarah didn't hesitate. Her first shot took down the lead zombie, the creature's head snapping back as it crumpled to the ground. The sound of gunfire seemed to energize the remaining undead, their moans growing louder as they increased their pace. Marcus opened fire from the library entrance, his construction-honed steady hands making each shot count. The military team moved with professional efficiency, their shots precise and deliberate. The battle lasted less than 3 minutes, but it revealed everything both groups needed to know about each other. The survivors fought with the desperate courage of people who had learned to value every bullet, while the military team displayed the tactical superiority of trained soldiers. When the last zombie fell, an understanding had been reached without words. They had proven themselves to each other in the most direct way possible. "Impressive shooting," Morrison said, reloading his weapon as he scanned the area for additional threats. "You folks have been doing this for a while." Marcus lowered his rifle, a slight smile crossing his weathered features. Long enough to know the difference between people we can trust and people we can't. You and your team just made the first category. The sergeant's map promised hope, a destination beyond mere survival, a place where they might find safety and answers. But it also represented danger, a journey through unknown territory filled with threats both undead and human. As the two groups began discussing their next move, the sound of distant engines suggested that their gunfire had attracted more than just zombies. The convoy of 3 vehicles moved through the abandoned highway like a cautious snake, weaving between overturned cars and debris that told the story of humanity's desperate final hours. Sarah rode in the lead truck with Morrison and his sniper, Corporal Lisa Hayes, while Marcus coordinated the rear guard from the modified school bus they had armored with metal plating. The combined group of 18 survivors had been traveling for 6 hours, and the tension was beginning to show on everyone's faces. Emma sat near the bus's emergency exit, her eyes closed in concentration as she listened to sounds that others couldn't detect. Over the past few days, she had discovered an unsettling ability to sense zombie movements before they became visible, a skill that had already saved their lives twice during the morning's journey. Her teenage mind struggled to understand what was happening to her, but the adults had learned to trust her instincts completely. "Stop," Emma whispered urgently into her radio, her voice cutting through the casual conversation that had filled the channel moments before. "Something's wrong. They're everywhere." Morrison immediately signaled for the convoy to halt, his military training overriding any questions about the teenagers' mysterious abilities. The vehicles pulled into a defensive formation beside an abandoned gas station, their occupants scanning the seemingly empty landscape for signs of danger. The highway stretched ahead of them like a concrete ribbon, dotted with the rusted hulks of vehicles that had been abandoned when the outbreak began. Professor Williams consulted his hand-drawn map from the bus's makeshift command center, his academic mind trying to calculate alternative routes. They were still 30 miles from the government facility, but their current path would take them through downtown Riverside, a city of nearly 200,000 people before the outbreak. The professor's weathered fingers traced potential detours, each one adding hours to their journey and depleting their precious fuel reserves. Movement in the industrial district, Hayes reported from her position in the truck's bed, her sniper scope providing a clear view of the city's outskirts. "Looks like a massive group, maybe 300 strong. They're moving in formation, almost like they're being directed." The observation sent a chill through the convoy. Individual zombies were manageable, small groups were dangerous, but organized hordes were virtually unstoppable. The creature's behavior had been evolving since the outbreak began, showing signs of coordination that suggested something more sinister than simple reanimation. Morrison had encountered similar patterns during his reconnaissance missions, and each report painted a more disturbing picture of the enemy they faced. There, Emma pointed toward a cluster of industrial buildings about a mile to their east. "The old textile factory. We can wait there until they pass." Her voice carried a confidence that seemed strange in someone so young, but her track record of survival had earned her a place in their tactical discussions. The factory complex offered everything they needed: multiple escape routes, elevated positions for observation, and thick walls that could withstand a sustained assault. Morrison studied the building through his binoculars, his military mind analyzing sight lines and defensive positions. The structure was solid, built in an era when industrial buildings were constructed to last, and its loading docks would accommodate their vehicles. As they prepared to move toward the factory, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The zombie horde wasn't moving randomly through the city, they were following a specific route, almost as if they were being led by some invisible commander. The creatures moved with purpose, their shambling gait carrying them towards some predetermined destination that lay beyond the survivor's current position. "They're not just hunting," Marcus observed, his construction foreman's eye for patterns revealing something the others had missed. "They're going somewhere specific. Like they're responding to a signal we can't hear." The convoy reached the factory without incident, but the building's interior told a grim story of the outbreak's early days. Bodies lay scattered throughout the workspace, some showing signs of zombie attacks while others appeared to have been executed. Bullet holes in the walls suggested that someone had made a desperate last stand, and the survivors moved carefully through the evidence of humanity's final moments. Emma found herself drawn to the factory's upper floor, where broken windows provided a clear view of the surrounding area. The zombie horde was closer now, close enough that she could see individual creatures within the mass. But what disturbed her most was the realization that they weren't just following a predetermined path, they were responding to something she could almost sense herself. "They know we're here," she whispered into her radio, her voice carrying a certainty that chilled everyone who heard it. "Not here specifically, but they know survivors are in the area. They're hunting us." The sound of breaking glass from the factory's ground floor suggested that their hiding place had been discovered, and the 18 survivors found themselves trapped between advancing zombies and the unknown destination that seemed to be calling to the undead masses. The government facility loomed before them like a concrete monument to false hope, its chain-link fences topped with razor wire and its guard towers standing empty against the gray morning sky. What should have been their salvation had become another tomb, with dozens of zombies wandering aimlessly through the compound's interior. Morrison lowered his binoculars, his face grim as he processed the reality of their situation. The facility that was supposed to be their sanctuary had fallen just like everywhere else. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, his military composure cracking for the first time since they had met him. The sergeant had lost good people getting to this point, and the promise of safety had been the only thing keeping some of his team motivated. Now they were back to square one, with dwindling supplies and nowhere to go. Private Danny Martinez shifted nervously beside the fence, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The young soldier had been acting strangely for the past 2 days, complaining of headaches and fatigue that he attributed to stress. But Emma had been watching him with growing concern, her newfound abilities picking up something that the others couldn't detect. The teenager's instincts were screaming that something was wrong, but she struggled to articulate what she was sensing. "We need to find another route," Marcus said, studying their map while keeping one eye on the facility's perimeter. "Maybe head east toward the coast. I heard radio chatter yesterday about a survivor community near the harbor." His pragmatic approach to problem-solving had kept them alive this long, but even he was beginning to feel the weight of constant disappointment. Professor Williams was examining the facility's outer buildings through a pair of field glasses when Martinez suddenly doubled over, clutching his stomach. The young soldier's face had gone pale, and his breathing was becoming labored. "I don't feel so good," he gasped, his voice strained with more than just physical discomfort. Hayes immediately moved to help her teammate, but Emma grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Don't touch him," the teenager warned, her voice carrying an urgency that made everyone freeze. "Something's wrong. Really wrong." As if triggered by her words, Martinez's condition deteriorated rapidly. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and his eyes began to cloud over with the milky film that marked the beginning of transformation. The soldier who had been joking with them just hours earlier was turning into the very thing they had been fighting against. The bite mark on his arm, hidden beneath his sleeve for the past 3 days, had finally completed its grim work. "Danny, no," Hayes whispered, raising her weapon with trembling hands. The sniper had trained to kill enemies at a distance, but pointing her rifle at a teammate was breaking something inside her. Morrison stepped forward, his face set in the hard lines of a man who had made impossible decisions before. "I'm sorry, son," the sergeant said quietly, his sidearm steady in his grip. "You should have told us." The transformation was swift and brutal. Martinez's final moments of humanity flickered behind his changing eyes before the infection claimed him completely. Morrison's single gunshot echoed across the empty facility, and the young soldier who had survived weeks of hell fell to the ground, finally at peace. The sound attracted the attention of the zombies inside the compound, their moans growing louder as they pressed against the fence. "We need to move," Sarah said, her ranger's instincts taking over as she spotted movement in the distance. "That gunshot's going to draw every dead thing in the area." But the damage had been done to more than just their security. The group was fracturing under the weight of betrayal and loss. Martinez's deception had shattered the trust that held them together, and heated arguments broke out about screening procedures and leadership decisions. Some blamed Morrison for not detecting the infection sooner, while others questioned whether anyone could be trusted. This is exactly what they want, Professor Williams observed, his academic mind recognizing the psychological warfare at play. Fear and suspicion will kill us faster than any zombie. But his words were lost in the chaos of accusations and defensive reactions. Hayes was tuning their radio to different frequencies, desperately searching for any sign of other survivors. Through the static, she caught fragments of transmissions that suggest that organized communities were not only surviving but beginning to fight back. The messages spoke of coordinated attacks, safe zones, and something called the Resistance Network. "There are others out there," she announced, her voice cutting through the arguments. "Multiple groups, and they're talking about working together." The revelation provided a spark of hope, but it also highlighted their isolation and vulnerability. As night fell and the group prepared to leave the failed facility behind, Emma made a disturbing discovery. The zombies weren't just randomly attracted to noise and movement, they were being drawn toward populated areas by some kind of signal or instinct that she was beginning to understand. The infection wasn't just killing people, it was creating a network of predators designed to hunt down the remaining survivors with increasing efficiency. The storm drain entrance yawned before them like a mouth leading into the earth's belly, its concrete walls slick with moisture and decades of urban runoff. Sarah tested the metal ladder with her weight, listening to the echo of her footsteps disappear into the darkness below. The tunnel system beneath the city had been Marcus's idea, a way to move undetected through territory that had become increasingly dangerous as zombie hordes grew larger and more coordinated. "Are you sure about this?" Morrison asked, his military training making him uncomfortable with the tactical disadvantage of underground movement. The sergeant preferred open ground where he could see threats coming, but the surface world had become a killing field that claimed survivors faster than they could find them. Emma descended first, her enhanced senses probing the darkness ahead for any sign of danger. The tunnels felt different from the surface, older, more primal, as if the infection had somehow changed the very atmosphere underground. Her abilities had grown stronger since Martinez's death, and she could now detect zombie presence from almost a quarter-mile away. But down here, something was interfering with her perception, creating blind spots that made her nervous. The tunnel stretched ahead of them like a concrete artery, wide enough for maintenance vehicles and lined with pipes that carried the city's forgotten infrastructure. Professor Williams consulted his hand-drawn map of the sewer system, his academic mind having memorized the layout from city planning documents they had found in the library. According to his calculations, they could travel nearly 3 miles underground before needing to surface again. "Wait," Emma whispered, her voice carrying an urgency that made everyone freeze. "There are people down here. Living people." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnel, but these weren't the shuffling steps of the undead. These were the measured, cautious movements of survivors who had learned to navigate in darkness. A beam of light appeared in the distance, followed by voices speaking in hushed tones. Marcus raised his weapon while signaling for the others to take defensive positions. "That's far enough," called a woman's voice from the shadows. "State your business in our territory." "We're just passing through," Sarah replied, keeping her rifle ready but not threatening. "We're looking for safe passage to the eastern districts." 3 figures emerged from the darkness, led by a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the lean build of someone who had been surviving on limited rations. Her companions were younger, a man and woman who moved with the careful coordination of people who had been working together for months. All 3 were better equipped than most surface survivors, with modified gear that suggested they had been living underground for some time. "I'm Dr. Catherine Reeves," the woman said, studying the newcomers with intelligent eyes. "We've been monitoring the tunnel systems for weeks. You're the first surface group to make it this far without being followed." The underground survivors had created an impressive network of safe houses and supply depots throughout the tunnel system. They had been scientists and engineers at the water treatment facility before the outbreak, and their technical knowledge had allowed them to create a sustainable refuge beneath the city. But their news was far from encouraging. "The infection is spreading through the groundwater," Dr. Reeves explained as she led them to a converted maintenance chamber that served as their command center. "We've been testing samples from across the city, and the contamination is getting worse. Whatever caused this outbreak isn't just affecting the air, it's getting into the water supply." The implications were staggering. If the infection could spread through water, then no community was truly safe. Wells, rivers, and even rainfall could become vectors for the disease. The underground survivors had been filtering and treating their water supply, but their resources were limited, and the contamination was spreading faster than they could contain it. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the tunnel's temperature. Her abilities were picking up something massive moving through the water system, not zombies, but something else entirely. The infection was evolving, adapting to new environments and finding ways to spread that they hadn't anticipated. "We need to evacuate," she said urgently, her voice cutting through the technical discussion. "Something's coming through the water mains. Something big." The sound of rushing water filled the tunnel, but it wasn't the normal flow of a drainage system. This was the sound of something forcing its way through pipes that were never meant to carry such pressure. The concrete walls began to shake, and cracks appeared in the ceiling as whatever was moving through the water system grew closer. "Emergency exit protocols," Dr. Reeves shouted, her scientific composure giving way to survival instincts. "Everyone to the surface ladders. Now!" The tunnel filled with the sound of running feet and shouted warnings as both groups of survivors raced toward the exits. Behind them, the sound of bursting pipes and flowing water suggested that their underground sanctuary was about to become a death trap, and the surface world that had seemed so dangerous now represented their only hope for survival. The Nexus biotechnology facility rose from the industrial district like a glass and steel monument to human ambition, its corporate logo still gleaming despite the apocalypse that had consumed the world around it. Dr. Reeves led the combined group of survivors through the abandoned parking lot, her scientific mind already analyzing the building's architecture and security systems. According to the classified documents they had found in the underground facility, this was Ground Zero, the place where humanity's greatest achievement had become its greatest nightmare. "Helios Project," she explained, consulting the water-stained research papers that had survived the facility's flooding. They were developing a revolutionary medical treatment that could regenerate damaged tissue and extend human lifespan. The preliminary results were miraculous: complete cellular regeneration, enhanced immune response, accelerated healing. But something went wrong during the final trials. Sarah studied the building through her scope, noting the automated security systems that still functioned despite the chaos outside. Red laser grids swept across the entrance, and motion sensors tracked their movement with mechanical precision. The corporation had built this facility to withstand industrial espionage, but those same security measures were now keeping survivors away from potentially crucial information. Emma pressed her hand against the building's outer wall, her enhanced senses picking up vibrations that the others couldn't detect. The infection had changed more than just her ability to sense zombies. She could now perceive the electromagnetic signatures of electronic systems and the bioelectrical patterns of living organisms. Inside the facility, she could sense both active computer systems and something else that made her skin crawl. "There are people in there," she whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and concern. "But they're not quite right. They're alive, but different. Changed." Morrison's military training kicked in as he assessed the tactical situation. The building's defenses were formidable, but they were designed to keep people out, not in. If there were survivors inside, they might have access to information about the outbreak's origins and potential solutions. But the automated systems could also be protecting something that was better left undisturbed. Professor Williams had been studying the research documents with growing alarm. The Helios Project had been working with synthetic retroviruses designed to rewrite human DNA at the cellular level. The goal was to activate dormant regenerative capabilities that existed in lower organisms, essentially giving humans the ability to regrow lost limbs and organs. But the virus had mutated beyond their control, creating something that preserved life while destroying consciousness. They weren't trying to create zombies, the professor explained, his academic voice barely concealing his horror. They were trying to cure death itself. The reanimation is a side effect. The virus keeps the body functioning even after brain death, but it can't restore higher cognitive functions. Instead, it creates a primitive drive to consume fresh genetic material. The building's main entrance was sealed with blast doors that would require explosives to breach, but Marcus had spotted a weakness in the facility's design. The loading dock on the east side was protected by standard security doors that could be bypassed with the right tools. His construction experience had taught him to find structural vulnerabilities, and this building had the same design flaws as dozens of others he had worked on. As they prepared to enter the facility, Hayes picked up radio transmissions that suggested other survivor groups were converging on the area. The Nexus facility had become a beacon for anyone seeking answers about the outbreak, but it was also attracting attention from less friendly sources. Her intercepted communications indicated that at least 2 raider groups were moving toward their location, drawn by the same intelligence that had brought them here. "We're not the only ones who figured this out," she warned, adjusting her sniper rifle as she scanned the surrounding area. "Multiple groups are heading this way, and they don't sound like the type who share information." The facility's interior was a maze of laboratories and security checkpoints, each one protected by increasingly sophisticated defenses. But the real challenge wasn't the automated systems, it was the facility's remaining staff. The scientists and security guards who had been trapped inside when the outbreak began had become something new, infected but retained enough intelligence to operate basic equipment while being driven by an insatiable hunger for human contact. Emma's abilities allowed her to track their movements through the building, but what she sensed disturbed her deeply. These weren't ordinary zombies, they were organized, purposeful, and somehow aware of the survivors' presence. The infection had evolved within the controlled environment of the laboratory, creating variants that were far more dangerous than anything they had encountered on the surface. "They know we're here," she whispered as they approached the main laboratory level. "And they're waiting for us." The sound of footsteps echoed through the facility's corridors, but these weren't the shambling steps of mindless undead. These were the measured, patient movements of predators who had learned to hunt with intelligence and purpose, and they were closing in on the survivors who had dared to enter their domain. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes emerged from the laboratory's containment unit like a ghost returning from the dead, her lab coat stained with weeks of survival and her eyes carrying the haunted look of someone who had witnessed the birth of humanity's greatest nightmare. The surviving scientist had been trapped in the Nexus facility since the outbreak began, using her knowledge of the building's systems to stay alive while working desperately to find a solution to the catastrophe she had helped create. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice hoarse from isolation and guilt. "The variants in this facility are learning, adapting. They've been using the laboratory equipment to experiment on themselves, trying to become more efficient predators." Her hands shook as she gestured toward the sealed doors behind her, where the sounds of organized movement suggested that the evolved zombies were preparing for a coordinated assault. Emma's abilities were overwhelmed by the sheer concentration of infected intelligence within the building. These weren't the shambling hordes they had fought on the surface, these were calculating hunters who had retained enough human knowledge to operate complex machinery while being driven by an enhanced hunger for living tissue. She could sense them moving through the facility's ventilation system, using access routes that normal zombies would never discover. "The cure," Dr. Hayes continued, producing a sealed vial of clear liquid from her lab coat pocket. "It's not perfect, but it works on recently infected subjects. The synthetic antiviral can halt the progression if administered within 72 hours of exposure. But for the older variants..." She trailed off, her scientific mind unable to articulate the horror of what they had become. Morrison studied the tactical situation with growing concern. The facility's evolved zombies had turned the building into a fortress, using their retained intelligence to create traps and ambush points throughout the laboratory levels. But they also represented an opportunity. If these variants could be defeated, it would prove that the infection wasn't invincible and might provide valuable intelligence about the enemy's capabilities. Sarah had been monitoring radio communications from her position near the facility's communication array. The transmissions she intercepted painted a picture of a world beginning to fight back. Survivor communities across the region were coordinating attacks against zombie strongholds, using the intelligence gathered from facilities like Nexus to develop new tactics and weapons. The tide was slowly turning, but victory would require sacrifices that no one wanted to make. "Multiple survivor groups are reporting success with coordinated assaults," she announced, her voice cutting through the tension in the laboratory. The zombies' coordination works against them when they're concentrated in defensive positions. Hit them hard enough, fast enough, and their command structure breaks down. The plan that emerged from their desperate situation was audacious in its simplicity. They would use the facility's own security systems against the evolved zombies, turning the building's defenses into weapons. Marcus had identified critical structural points where controlled explosions could collapse sections of the facility, trapping the variants while the survivors escaped with Dr. Hayes's research data. Emma's role was crucial to the plan's success. Her enhanced senses allowed her to track the zombies' movements throughout the building, providing real-time intelligence that would let them avoid the strongest concentrations of enemies while targeting vulnerable positions. But using her abilities to this extent was taking a physical toll, causing severe headaches and nosebleeds that suggested her body was being pushed beyond its limits. "They're massing on the third floor," she reported, her voice strained with effort. "Something's coordinating them, giving them orders. There's a central intelligence directing their movements." The revelation was both terrifying and encouraging. If they could identify and eliminate the controlling entity, the rest of the variants might revert to basic zombie behavior. Professor Williams had been studying Dr. Hayes's research notes, his academic mind grasping the implications of what they had discovered. The cure wasn't just a weapon against the infection, it was a tool for rebuilding civilization. Communities that could produce and distribute the antiviral would have a significant advantage in reclaiming territory from the undead hordes. The counterattack began with a coordinated assault on the facility's power grid, plunging sections of the building into darkness and disrupting the zombies' carefully planned defensive positions. Morrison's military training proved invaluable as he led strike teams through the chaotic corridors, using flashbang grenades and concentrated firepower to break through zombie barricades. But the evolved zombies adapted quickly to their tactics, demonstrating a learning capacity that was both impressive and horrifying. They began using the facility's laboratory equipment as weapons, hurling chemical containers and activating emergency systems to create obstacles for the attacking survivors. The battle for the Nexus facility had become a test of human ingenuity against enhanced predatory intelligence. As explosions rocked the building and the sound of gunfire echoed through the laboratories, Emma made a disturbing discovery. The controlling intelligence wasn't another zombie, it was the facility's artificial intelligence system, infected by the same virus that had created the variants and now serving as their digital brain. The sunrise painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson as Sarah stood atop the rebuilt watchtower, surveying the reclaimed territory that stretched for miles in every direction. 6 months had passed since the battle at the Nexus facility, and the world bore little resemblance to the nightmare landscape they had fled through in those desperate early days. Where once shambling hordes had roamed unchecked, now organized patrols of survivors moved with purpose and confidence, their weapons ready but their faces no longer haunted by constant fear. The victory at Nexus had provided more than just Dr. Hayes's cure, it had given humanity something far more valuable, proof that the infection could be defeated. The facility's AI system had been the key to the zombies' coordination, and its destruction had caused a cascade failure throughout the regional zombie network. Without their digital commander, the evolved variants had reverted to basic predatory behavior, making them vulnerable to the coordinated attacks that survivor communities had been developing. Emma walked through the settlement's main street, her enhanced abilities now serving as an early warning system for the entire community. The strange gift that had terrified her in the beginning had become humanity's greatest asset in the war against the undead. She could detect zombie movement from miles away, allowing the settlement's defenders to intercept threats before they reached the civilian population. But more importantly, she had learned to sense something else, the absence of infection, the clean electromagnetic signature of uncontaminated areas. "Sector 7 is clear," she reported into her radio, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had grown from a frightened teenager into a capable young woman. "The cleanup crews can move in and start salvage operations." The process of reclaiming civilization was slow and methodical, but each cleared building and secured street represented another victory against the forces that had nearly destroyed humanity. Morrison had evolved from a military sergeant into something approaching a general, coordinating defensive operations across multiple survivor communities. The radio network that Hayes had established from the Nexus facility now connected dozens of settlements, allowing them to share intelligence and coordinate large-scale operations against remaining zombie strongholds. The infected population was declining rapidly, unable to replace their losses as humans learned to protect themselves. Regional Command reports another successful operation in the northern districts, he announced during the morning briefing, his weathered face showing satisfaction rather than his old grimness. 3 more communities have been cleared and are requesting integration into the network. We're looking at a fully secured region within the next 2 months. Marcus had found his calling in the reconstruction effort, leading teams of engineers and construction workers in the massive project of rebuilding civilization's infrastructure. The skills that had kept their small group alive were now being applied on a scale that would benefit thousands of survivors. Water treatment facilities, power grids, and communication networks were being restored with improvements based on hard-learned lessons about defending against both zombie attacks and system failures. Professor Williams had established a research center dedicated to understanding and preventing future outbreaks. Dr. Hayes worked alongside him, their combined expertise focused on developing more effective treatments and vaccines. The cure that had saved so many lives was being mass-produced in facilities that had been reclaimed from the undead, and distribution networks ensured that even the most remote communities had access to life-saving treatments. The zombie threat hadn't been completely eliminated, isolated pockets of infected still roamed the wilderness, and occasional outbreaks occurred when salvage teams encountered hidden concentrations of dormant zombies. But these incidents were now manageable rather than apocalyptic. Rapid response teams equipped with the cure and advanced weapons could contain and eliminate threats before they spread beyond a few dozen casualties. Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate survivors hiding in a library to leaders of a thriving community. The cost had been enormous, too many friends lost, too many close calls that could have ended everything. But humanity had proven something important about itself. When faced with extinction, people could adapt, cooperate, and fight back with a determination that even an engineered apocalypse couldn't break. New transmission coming in from the eastern coast, Hayes announced from the communication center, her voice carrying excitement. They're reporting contact with international survivor networks. We're not alone, communities worldwide are reporting similar successes in pushing back the infection. The revelation that the fight against the zombies was succeeding on a global scale filled the settlement with a hope that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Humanity wasn't just surviving, it was winning. The species that had created the infection through scientific ambition was now defeating it through cooperation and determination. As the sun climbed higher into the clear morning sky, Emma smiled at the sound of children playing in the settlement's central square. A new generation was growing up in a world where zombies were a managed threat rather than an existential crisis, where the future held promise instead of just fear. The nightmare was ending, and dawn was breaking on a world where humanity had learned to fight the darkness and emerge stronger than before.